Snow came sideways, not down, needles of it, driven hard enough to sting through wool and eyelids. The settlement's main street had vanished under a single smooth drift, as if the land had been erased and redrawn in white. Somewhere beyond the last cabin, a bell clanged once, then went quiet, swallowed by wind. Mara Kessler ran with her head low, one mittened hand clamped over the scarf at her mouth. The air felt thin and sharp, like breathing broken glass. Her eyelashes were already crusting. Every exhale turned to frost that tried to glue her lips shut. At the foot of the hill, she found the door she'd built so low people had mocked it as a dog hole. Tonight, it was half buried. The drift had risen to the latch. She had maybe 12 minutes, not because she owned a watch. Watches didn't survive long out here, but because she knew what happened when the compost bed stopped breathing. The heat would fall off like a cliff. The inner air would hit 0°C, the plants would go limp, and by morning the only greenhouse in 5 miles would be a glass coffin under snow. She drove her shoulder into the drift, carving a hollow with brute force, then dug with her hands until her knuckles hit wood. The latch was stiff, rimed with ice. She pried at it with the tip of her belt knife, feeling the metal bite, feeling time bleed away in each tiny movement. The door opened with a moan of warped boards. Inside, the world changed. The wind died as if someone had shut a lid on it. The air held damp warmth that fogged her lashes, and the smell hit next, sweet rot and earth and a faint sour note that meant the compost was working, still chewing through straw and manure, still exhaling heat like an animal. Under her boots, the packed dirt floor wasn't frozen. It gave slightly, alive. A lantern hung from a hook in the entry tunnel. Its flame wavered but did not go out. Mara set it higher, shielding it from the draught, and listened. The greenhouse spoke in small noises when it was healthy, a soft drip from condensation, a slow creak where the roof ribs took weight, a gentle hiss from the vent gap she'd cut on purpose. Tonight the hiss sounded wrong, too thin, like a throat closing. She moved down the sloped passage, shoulders brushing the earth walls. The structure was half underground, dug into the south face of the hill so the ground could hug it with steadier temperature. Above, a low roof of scavenged window panes and oiled cloth leaned toward the winter sun, when there was sun. Along the north side, the hill rose like a sheltering shoulder, dark and solid. The beds sat in a row of shallow boxes. In them, lettuce rosettes lifted pale green leaves toward the lantern glow, tender as new skin. Mara's throat tightened at the sight, not from cold this time. Outside, people were scraping flour from sacks and arguing about how many spoonfuls a child deserved. Outside, the last dried beans had been counted twice and still felt like a mistake. Outside, the supply wagon was 2 days late and the river road had already started to close. Inside, something was still growing. Mara knelt at the compost trench that ran beside the beds, covered with planks. She lifted one plank, and a breath of warmer air rose, carrying that sour, sweet smell stronger. Steam should have fogged her face. It didn't. She slid her hand into the gap, palm down, as close as she dared. The heat was there, but weak, like a dying stove. "Come on," she whispered, not praying to any saint, just bargaining with bacteria and physics. She checked the vent line first. A clay pipe ran from the far end of the compost trench up to the roof ridge, meant to pull stale air out as warm air rose. If the outlet iced shut, the compost would choke, go anaerobic, and the heat would collapse. She reached up to the ridge seam where she'd left a narrow slit under a flap of canvas. Snow had packed against it from the outside, sealing it like plaster. Mara's fingers went numb as she scraped, and the canvas snapped in the wind's tug. She swore, not loud. Sound felt precious in this tight place. Her knife blade worked the seam open, shaving ice away in curls. A thin gasp of air followed, then another. The hiss strengthened. The greenhouse exhaled, but the drift outside was still climbing, pressing against the roof like a slow hand. If the roof ribs bowed, panes would pop, and then all the warmth she'd stolen from earth and rot would bleed into the storm in a single minute. She stood and looked along the roof line. In the lantern light, she could see a sag near the center, subtle but new. Her stomach clenched. She pictured the mockery in the trading shed weeks ago, men laughing that she'd built a grave with windows. She pictured the councilman's shrug when she asked for extra nails. They weren't here now. It was just her, the hill, and the weight of snow. Mara grabbed the long-handled shovel propped by the door and climbed onto the narrow service ledge that ran along the north wall. She'd designed it so she could reach the ribs from inside. Her breath made ghosts in the lantern glow. She jammed the shovel blade up under the sagging rib and pushed, hard, feeling the wood flex back toward its proper curve. Then she wedged a spare support post beneath it, an aspen pole she'd kept for exactly this night. The roof creaked, protested, then held. Outside, the wind screamed like it wanted to tear the hill apart. Inside, lettuce leaves trembled in the faint draft, still alive, still green. Mara counted her own breaths to keep from counting everything else. Days of food, hours of storm, miles of blocked road. She forced herself back to the compost trench. If she could wake the heat, stabilize the air, the plants would survive the night. If the plants survived, the settlement had something besides flour dust and fear. She lifted 2 more planks and peered into the compost. The top layer looked too dry, straw pale, not darkening the way it should. Compost heat didn't come from magic. It came from moisture, oxygen, and the right balance of carbon and nitrogen. Too dry, and the microbes slowed. Too wet, and the air disappeared. She dipped a hand in. The straw crumbled, not clumped, dry. Mara's jaw tightened. Water was rationed, but heat was rationed too, and she couldn't carry warmth in a bucket from anywhere else. She stood, made the decision, and pulled the small barrel from the corner, the one she'd filled in autumn with meltwater and kept inside so it wouldn't freeze. It was meant for seedlings. Tonight, it was meant for survival. As she tipped the dipper into the trench, the water vanished into the straw with a thirsty sound. She worked fast, spacing it along the length rather than dumping in one spot, and with each pour, she listened for the compost's response, like listening to a sick animal's breathing. Somewhere outside, faint through earth and boards, she heard shouting, human voices carried on the storm. The town wasn't sleeping. Hunger kept people awake. Mara poured the last dipper and set the barrel back, lighter than it should have been. She pressed the planks down, sealed the trench, then sat back on her heels. For a moment, there was nothing but wind and her own pulse. Then, slowly, the greenhouse hiss grew steadier. A thin veil of steam began to curl up around the plank seams. The air warmed enough that her cheeks prickled, thawing. She let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. 12 minutes had become 4, then 2, then none. The collapse she'd feared hadn't happened, yet, but the storm was only beginning, and she could feel it in the way the roof still trembled now and then, as if the hill itself was shivering. Mara looked at the lettuce again. The leaves were small, not enough to impress a laughing crowd, but each rosette was a promise, and promises mattered when roads disappeared. "Hold on," she told them, as if they could hear. "Just hold on." By dawn, the storm had not ended so much as changed its shape. The wind eased, but the cold sharpened, as if the sky had wrung itself dry and left only hard air behind. Mara stepped out of the low door into a trench she'd carved with her own shoulders. Above her, the hill wore a smooth cap of snow that glittered faintly in the grey light. The settlement lay muffled and lopsided, roofs rounded, chimneys smoking weakly. No wagon bells, no hoofbeats, just the sound of a shovel striking ice somewhere down the buried street. Mara pulled her scarf tighter and walked, because hiding her greenhouse had never been part of her plan. The whole point of building something strange in plain sight was that sooner or later the town would need to understand why it worked. At the meeting house, men crowded near the iron stove, hands out like beggars. Someone had chalked ration numbers on a slate, flour scoops, bean counts, a line that read, "No more salt meat." A woman held a crying child and stared at the stove as if heat could turn into food. Councilman Harlan DeWitt stood at the front with his coat still buttoned, as if he could posture winter into obedience. He saw Mara come in with snow in her hair and dirt still under her nails, and his mouth tightened. "You're out early," he said. "I was up all night," Mara answered. She kept her voice level. If she let anger into it, they'd hear only a woman scolding. The roof held. A snort came from the bench near the wall. Josiah Pike, the man who sold nails when he felt like it, leaned back with a grin that made his cheeks look too round for such a thin winter. "Your buried glass box still standing? That's a miracle, or you've got the devil shoveling for you." A few chuckles, not cruel exactly, familiar. Laughter was cheap warmth. Mara met Josiah's eyes. "The devil doesn't know compost ratios," she said. That got more laughter, sharper this time. Someone muttered, "Compost," as if the word itself were a joke. DeWitt lifted a hand. "We have serious business. The river road's blocked. The wagon from Larch Bend hasn't been seen in 3 days. We'll stretch what we have. We'll do what?" Mara cut in before she could stop herself. The room quieted a little. Her heart thumped once, hard. Stretch flour into air, feed children on sermons. A murmur of disapproval. The preacher's wife shifted, lips pressed tight. Mara felt the familiar weight of it. She wasn't from here, not truly. She'd arrived 2 summers ago with a dead husband's tools and an idea that didn't fit their rules. DeWitt's face reddened. "Mind your tongue." Mara forced her hands to unclench. "Mind your math," she said softer. "You're counting stores like the road will open on command. It won't." Josiah leaned forward. "And your answer is dirt? You want us all eating earthworms?" Mara turned toward him, and toward the rest of them, and chose her words like she chose nails, only the ones that would hold. "My answer is heat you can't steal from the wind," she said. "The hill doesn't care about storms. The ground stays near 7C down a few feet, even when the air is 30C. If you put your walls in the earth gives back what the night takes." "Sounds like a grave," someone said. "It's a greenhouse," Mara replied. "Half buried, south-facing, low roof angle so winter sun hits it straight instead of sliding off. Reflectors to throw more light inside." DeWitt crossed his arms. "Reflectors?" "Whitewashed boards," Mara said. "Old tin if you have it. Anything bright angled toward the glass. Light becomes heat when it hits dark soil and stone. And the compost." She heard the scoff before she saw it. A young man near the stove, Eli Brooks, shook his head. "You're telling us to warm food with rot." "Rot that produces heat," Mara shot back. "A compost bed can reach 50C if it's built right. Layers of straw and manure, kept damp, with air moving through. That heat rises into the beds. It's not pretty. Neither is hunger." The room held a thick silence. Mara could feel their resistance like a wall. Some of it was fear of the unknown. Some of it was something uglier. The idea that if a woman could solve a winter problem with a shovel and stubbornness, then their winter plans, prayer, rationing, waiting, looked thin. DeWitt finally spoke, voice clipped. "We're not digging holes in January. We need hands for clearing roofs and keeping fires. If you want to play farmer under the ground, do it on your own time." Mara nodded once, as if accepting a verdict. But inside, something hardened. "I already did," she said, "and I'm not asking permission to keep it alive." She turned to leave. Behind her, the preacher's wife called, not unkindly, "Mara, it isn't proper." Mara paused at the door. The cold air knifed in around the frame. Neither is starving, she said, and stepped back into the snow. As she walked toward the hill, she heard shovels again, and distant voices. The settlement was busy surviving in the usual way, scraping and burning and hoping. Mara's way was quieter. Dirt walls, angled light, heat made by unseen workers in the compost. They had laughed today. She kept walking anyway, because she could already picture the day they would stop. The hill's south face was the only place winter felt hesitant. Even under cloud, the light was different there, less blue, more silver, because it bounced off snow and struck the slope at a lower angle. Mara had chosen that spot in late summer, standing with a stick in the dirt to track where the sun fell at noon, then again at mid-afternoon. She'd marked the longest shadow lines with stones like breadcrumbs. Now, with the storm drifted high, the greenhouse looked like part of the hillside itself, an earthen lip, a low glazed plane, and a narrow door you had to stoop for. No proud glass house, no straight walls to present to the wind, just something that hid in the landscape and stole warmth by inches. Mara set her tools on the service bench inside, hand auger, mallet, a coil of tarred rope, and went straight to the north wall. The wall wasn't wood, it was the hill, packed earth faced with stone she'd pried loose from the creek bed, stacked tight, then plastered with a clay-sand mix to seal drafts. Stone did two jobs. It blocked wind, and it held heat. The previous night, when the compost dipped, the wall had radiated its stored warmth back into the air like a slow-breathing stove. She pressed her palm to it. Cool, but not biting. Good, she murmured. She moved along the beds, checking for frost crystals on leaves, checking the soil for the hard feel of freezing. The lettuce was upright. A few tips showed slight burn where cold air had licked them near the entry tunnel, but the core leaves were supple. A sound came from above, a faint tick-tick. Snow sliding? Or glass flexing? Mara climbed onto the ledge and looked up at the roof structure. The ribs were made from split spruce, light, springy. Between them, she'd set window panes scavenged from abandoned cabins and trade wagons, framed with thin strips and bedded in linseed putty she'd made herself. Where she couldn't get glass, she'd stretched oiled canvas, layered, then stitched it so it would shed water. The tick came again. One pane, near the center, had a hairline crack. It wasn't leaking yet, but it would. Glass was honest. It told you the future in small lines. Mara exhaled slowly. She couldn't replace a pane, not with supplies cut off. So she did what she'd always done. She altered the problem until it fit her resources. She fetched a strip of cloth, warmed pine resin over the lantern until it softened, and smeared it along the crack from inside, pressing the cloth into it like a bandage. Resin wouldn't stop a full break, but it would hold the line from running, and it would seal out drafts. She added a thin wood brace across the frame, tied with tarred rope in a figure 8, so the tension would distribute instead of pulling one point. Her mind counted loads without meaning to. Wet snow could weigh 100 kilos per square meter. Dry powder less, but storms changed fast. That was why she'd pitched the roof low, about 35, steep enough that when the sun did appear, it could soften the lower layer and help it slide. Too steep, and the winter sun would strike at a shallow angle and reflect away, wasting light. Too flat, and snow would sit like a blanket of ice. Compromise, always. On the outside of the glazing, she'd built reflectors, boards painted with lime wash, hinged so she could tilt them. When the sun was low, she angled them to bounce light onto the dark soil beds. Dark absorbs. Light becomes heat. Simple as that. But simple didn't mean easy when your fingers were numb and your neighbors called you filthy. She adjusted one reflector now, testing its hinge. It squealed softly. The hinge pin was a nail, bent and straightened twice. It would hold. Everything here held by refusing to quit. At midday, the clouds thinned enough to show a pale disk of sun. The interior temperature rose just a touch. Mara could feel it in the way condensation formed faster, in the way the air stopped biting her nostrils. She took the opportunity to do the work that mattered most, fixing the earth around her. A semi-buried greenhouse fails if water pools. Freeze-thaw can pry walls apart. Standing water steals heat and turns soil into a brick. Mara had dug a drainage trench beneath the floor, packed with fist-sized stones, then covered with sand, sloped gently toward a sump pit at the downhill end. From there, a clay pipe carried excess water out to a rock-lined soakaway beyond the door, where it would freeze harmlessly away from the walls. She checked the sump. Ice had formed in a thin ring, but the center was clear. Water still moved. A knock sounded, soft, hesitant, on the outer door. Mara froze, listening. Another knock, then the muffled scrape of boots. She didn't like visitors here, not because she feared theft, though hunger could make thieves, but because curiosity came wrapped in judgment. Still, she couldn't ignore it. In a small settlement, refusing a door was a statement. She opened the latch. Eli Brooks stood in the entry trench, hat in his hands. His face was raw from wind, and his eyes were fixed on the low door, as if it might bite. "I wasn't sent," he said quickly. I saw you walking out here every day. I figured you had to be either crazy or right." Mara held the door open a crack wider, letting him see the warm fog inside. "Pick one," she said. He swallowed. The smell of compost reached him, and he flinched, but he didn't step back. If the road stays shut, can it really grow enough? Mara looked past him toward the buried town, toward chimneys and ration slates and stubborn pride. She thought of the lettuce leaves, small and brave. "Not if I'm the only one building," she said. "But it can grow something, and something is the difference between waiting to starve and working to live." Eli's gaze shifted to her hands, cracked knuckles, dirt ground into the skin. "They're saying it's not clean," he muttered. Mara's mouth tightened. "Clean is a luxury," she said. "Sanitary is a method. If you want to talk about method, step inside." He hesitated one heartbeat longer, then ducked through the low door, and the greenhouse swallowed him into its warm, earthy breath. Eli stood just inside the entry tunnel, shoulders hunched, eyes wide the way men's eyes got when they walked into a space that contradicted winter. The air beaded on his beard. He took one careful step, then another, as if warmth might crack beneath him. "You keep it like this with that?" He nodded toward the compost trench, where a faint ribbon of steam slipped from the plank seams. "With that, and with the hill," Mara said. She picked up the lantern and led him along the beds so he wouldn't step on anything. "And with not letting the wind touch what I'm trying to save." Eli's gaze tracked the lettuce. His expression softened, then tightened again at the smell. "It's strong. It's alive," Mara corrected. She crouched and lifted a plank. "Smell is information. If it stings your eyes, too much ammonia, too much fresh manure, not enough carbon. If it smells like swamp, it's gone without air." Eli leaned in, then jerked back when the warm breath hit him. "So you just pile it up?" Mara shook her head. "Piling is how you get a cold heap. Heat comes from balance." She pointed with the lantern. "Bottom layer is coarse sticks for air channels, then straw, carbon, then manure, nitrogen, then chopped leaves, each layer about a handspan thick, damp like a wrung cloth, not soaked." He frowned. "Why not soaked? More water seems like more something." "More water blocks air," Mara said. "Microbes need oxygen. If they drown, the heat stops and the smell turns foul. That's when you get sickness, not warmth." Eli's face pinched. "That's what folks mean by unclean?" "Folks think unclean means unfamiliar," Mara said. She set the plank back down and walked him to the far end, where a clay pipe disappeared into the earth. This is the lungs. Fresh air comes in low, warms as it passes through, then exits high. If it can't exit, the heap chokes. If it exits too fast, it cools. She tapped the pipe. I learned that last month. Eli looked at her. Something went wrong? Mara's hands paused on the pipe. Memory sharpened. I woke up to a sharp smell and drooping seedlings, she said. The vent flap had frozen shut overnight. The heap turned sour. Heat dropped. I nearly lost everything. And you fixed it. I cut a second outlet, Mara said, pointing up to a small canvas flap near the ridge. And I built a baffle inside the pipe, just a scrap board, to slow the draw so it doesn't pull heat out too quickly, like putting a damper on a stove. Eli's shoulders eased, as if the word stove made this make sense. You talk like you've got numbers for it. I do. Mara reached behind a bed and pulled out a small board with chalk marks. Not a thermometer, those were rare, but a simple record of observations. Condensation line height, compost steam strength, how long the lantern flame leaned when a draft formed. If the condensation line climbs above the third rib, it's too humid. Mold follows. If it drops below the first rib, it's too dry. Growth slows. Eli stared at the marks, then at her. You can tell all that without measuring? I measure with my eyes, Mara said, and with failures. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. No wonder people think you're strange. Mara's mouth twitched. Strange is surviving when the usual way doesn't. Eli shifted his boots. If I wanted to build one, where would I put it? Mara looked at him carefully. This was how things changed, not with councils, but with one person willing to admit a question. South-facing slope, she said. Not in the low ground. Cold air pools like water. You want a place where wind can pass above you, not into you. Dig until the soil stays damp and not frozen. Around 1 m down, sometimes less if the hill is kind. Eli nodded slowly, absorbing it. And the roof? Low and strong, Mara said. Ribs close together. Glass if you have it. If not, oiled cloth double-layered. But you must brace for snow load. You saw my posts. He glanced up at the supports wedged under the rib. Yeah. Mara's gaze dropped to the lettuce again. This isn't a parlor trick, she said quietly. It's food. But food takes time. Lettuce needs weeks, even in warmth. If you start digging after you're starving, you've already lost. Eli's eyes flicked away. Outside, the settlement was already leaning toward that edge. Then why didn't they listen in autumn? He asked. Mara's throat tightened. Because believing costs pride, she said, and pride feels cheaper than work, until it doesn't. A sudden gust hammered the roof. The whole greenhouse shuddered, and a thin line of snow sifted down between two panes like salt. Eli flinched. Mara didn't. She moved immediately to the roofline, feeling for cold drafts with the back of her hand. The resin bandage held. The brace held. But the gust reminded her of a different danger, one she'd been trying not to name. Snow didn't just weigh roofs down. It buried doors. Mara's eyes went to the entry tunnel. If another drift sealed it completely, this warm pocket would become a trap. Heat without escape could turn deadly in a different way, too. Carbon dioxide from compost, humidity, mold. Survival systems didn't fail in one direction. They failed in all directions, if you stopped paying attention. Eli watched her, reading the tension. What is it? Mara swallowed. If the road doesn't open, she said, people will come here, not to ask, to demand. Eli's face went pale. He understood the same truth she did. Hunger didn't respect property lines. Mara lowered the lantern. So if you want to build, she said, voice firm now, start before the storm decides for you. And if you want to help me keep this one safe, bring me nails, canvas, anything that seals. Eli hesitated only a moment. Then he nodded, once, like a man stepping over a line he couldn't step back from. I'll see what I can do, he said. Mara watched him duck back out into the cold, and she felt the open loop tighten like a rope. The greenhouse worked, but would it survive the people it was meant to save? 2 days later, the settlement center had become a place of transactions that felt more like confessions. People traded buttons for firewood, a tin cup for 2 potatoes, a hymn for a promise. The cold kept everyone moving fast, but hunger made them linger in doorways, watching one another's hands. Mara went to the trading shed because she needed one thing: glass putty. Not store-bought, there was none, but linseed oil, chalk, and something to bulk it, anything that would keep wind from sneaking through her frames. The crack she'd bandaged with resin would hold only if the rest of the seams stayed tight. Inside, the shed smelled of damp wool and sour breath. Josiah Pike sat behind the counter like a judge. His shelves were mostly bare: a few nails in a jar, a spool of wire, a sack of oats with the bottom cinched tight as if it could be hidden by string. He looked up when Mara entered and smiled too widely. "Well," he said, drawing the word out, "the hill woman herself." Mara ignored the title. "I need linseed," she said, "and chalk, powdered, if you have it." Josiah's eyebrows rose. "For your little underground garden?" "Greenhouse," Mara corrected. A couple of men by the stove turned to listen. Conversations died down. Curiosity always smelled opportunity. Mara felt their eyes weigh her pockets, her hands. Josiah leaned forward. "Got anything to trade?" Mara reached into her coat and placed a small bundle on the counter, a fist-sized lump of beeswax she'd saved from summer. "This," she said, "and I can spare a handful of lettuce in a week." A laugh barked from the stove corner. "Lettuce," a man repeated, as if she'd offered pearls. Josiah's smile sharpened. "Fresh greens in winter. That's a tale for children." "It's a fact," Mara said evenly, "and facts don't care if you're entertained." The man by the stove, Eli's cousin, Henry Brooks, stood up. He was broad, red-faced, and too loud for the small room. "You know what the preacher says? That digging into the earth for warmth is wrong, like you're hiding from God's season." Mara kept her gaze on Josiah, but she answered Henry. "God made the earth," she said. "I'm using what I was given." Henry scoffed. "Or you're breeding sickness down there. Rot and mold. My wife won't have the children near it." Mara's jaw tightened. "Then don't bring them," she said. "But don't pretend your smoke-filled cabins are pure." Josiah lifted a hand like he was soothing animals. Now, we're all neighbors." Mara's eyes narrowed. "Neighbors don't ration nails like gold," she said. A couple of men shifted. Josiah's smile faltered for a blink. "Supply is scarce," he said. "So is honesty," Mara replied. She pointed at the jar of nails. "Those are cut nails. You've got enough to mend 3 roofs. You're waiting for desperation so you can name your price." The shed went quiet, thick with the kind of silence that meant she'd hit true. Josiah's fingers drummed on the counter. "Maybe I am," he said softly. "Maybe that's just smart." Mara leaned in. She didn't raise her voice. "Smart is keeping people alive so you still have customers in spring," she said. "You want to make profit on a cemetery?" Josiah's eyes flicked away. For all his bluster, he wasn't immune to images. Nobody was this winter. Henry grunted. "Even if your whole house works, you can't feed all of us with salad." Mara turned fully now, letting them see the certainty she'd built, plank by plank. "No," she said, "not all of you. Not unless you help build more. But greens do 2 things you're forgetting." She held up one finger. "First, they keep scurvy away. You can live on flour for weeks, then your gums bleed and your wounds don't heal. I've seen it." A second finger. "Second, they change how people think. A belly with something fresh in it doesn't panic as fast." Henry opened his mouth to argue, but Mara cut him off with the only kind of language he respected: numbers. A bed 1.2 m, 1.2 min by 3 m, 3 m can hold about 100 lettuce plants if you space them tight for cut and come again, she said. Harvest leaves, not heads, and they regrow. You don't need acres. You need insulation and patience. The men stared, not because they believed, but because specificity sounded like authority. Josiah cleared his throat. Even if I had linseed, he said, it'd cost. Mara slid the beeswax closer. Wax seals lantern wicks and boots, she said. You know its value. Josiah hesitated. Then, with the air of a man doing her a favor, he reached under the counter and produced a small bottle of thick oil and a cloth bag of chalk dust. That's all, he said. Mara took them and wrapped them tight. That's enough, she replied. As she turned to leave, Henry called after her, voice half taunt, half need. When your fancy dirt house collapses, don't come begging. Mara paused at the door. The cold air outside smelled cleaner than the room's spite. When it holds, she said without turning, remember you laughed first. She stepped out, boots crunching on packed snow, and felt the settlement behind her like pressure on the back of her neck. The social weather was turning as surely as the sky. People could endure cold. They struggled to endure being wrong. That night, the temperature dropped so fast the world seemed to creak. Water in cups, skinned over in minutes. The stove in Mara's cabin ate wood and gave back only a grudging warmth. She slept in her clothes and still woke with pain in her joints, as if cold had crawled into her bones to nest. Before dawn, she went to the greenhouse with a lantern under her coat. The sky was clear, no clouds, no mercy, and stars glittered like metal filings. Clear nights meant radiative cooling. The ground bled heat into the open sky, and anything exposed paid the price. At the low door, she found what she'd feared. The drift had shifted. Snow pressed into the entry trench and up against the door frame. She could still open it, but only after shoving with both shoulders. The hinges groaned like an old man. Inside, warmth met her, thin but present. The lantern fogged the air. Lettuce leaves lifted in the dimness. Some edges curled from cold stress, but not dead. Mara knelt and checked the compost trench. Too hot. Steam poured up when she lifted a plank, thick enough to wet her face. The smell was sharper, ammonia heavy. The microbes had surged after yesterday's watering, and now the heap was sprinting. Sprinting heaps didn't last. They burned through their fuel and then crashed. Worse, excessive heat could push humidity high enough to invite mold, and mold could wipe a bed faster than frost. Mara forced herself not to panic. Overheating was a better problem than freezing, but it was still a problem. This system had to ride a narrow line, warm enough to grow, dry enough to stay healthy, vented enough to breathe, sealed enough to keep heat. She lowered the plank, then opened the ridge flap a thumb's width more. The draft strengthened immediately. Steam thinned. Then she saw the other sign, the one that made her stomach drop. The lantern flame leaned sideways. A draft was entering from somewhere low, cold air sliding in like water. Cold air was heavier. It pooled, creeping along the floor, finding roots, chilling them first. If the beds chilled at the base, the plants would stall, even if the air stayed warm. Mara moved with the back of her hand, held out like a blind person's cane, feeling for the bite of cold. Near the far corner, behind the storage barrels, her knuckles stung. She pulled the barrels aside and found a gap where the earth wall met the wood framing. A crack the width of her little finger, opened by freeze-thaw and the roof's shifting weight. She swore under her breath. That gap would widen with every night cycle. It would become a mouth. She had putty now, linseed and chalk. But putty alone wouldn't bridge a moving seam. Mara cut a strip of canvas, soaked it in warm resin, then packed it into the crack like a gasket. Over that, she pressed putty, smoothing it with a damp finger so it feathered onto both surfaces. Then she tacked a thin board over it as a cover plate, nailed into the framing. Careful, because nails were suddenly more valuable than coins. When she stepped back, the lantern flame stood straighter. The floor air lost its knife edge. Mara let herself breathe. A soft sound came from the entry tunnel, snow shifting, settling. She looked toward the door and saw fine powder sifting down from the top of the trench, like hourglass sand. The drift was creeping again. If the door sealed completely, she could dig it out, if she was outside. If she was inside when it sealed, she'd have to break through from within, and earth and snow were stronger than people gave them credit for. Panic would burn oxygen faster than compost ever could. Mara went to her tool rack and pulled down the hand auger and a length of pipe. She'd planned for this, though she hadn't wanted to admit it. She drilled a small emergency vent hole through the entry tunnel roof, angled upward toward the surface so snow couldn't easily pack it. The pipe would serve as a snorkel if the door buried, a way for fresh air to find her and for stale air to leave. She capped it with a loose-fitting tin hood outside, weighted with a stone, so wind wouldn't drive snow straight down. She tested the drawer by holding the lantern near the pipe. The flame flickered toward it, faint but noticeable. Air movement. Insurance. As she worked, she heard footsteps outside, crunching fast, then stopping near the door. A fist thudded once, hard. "Mara!" a voice shouted, muffled by snow. "Open up!" It was DeWitt. Mara's spine tightened. She didn't like the sound of urgency in his voice. Urgency in a hungry town meant something had broken. She pulled the door open. Cold rushed in, making the greenhouse shiver. DeWitt stood in the trench with two men behind him, faces pinched, eyes darting past her shoulder. "The river crossing's gone," DeWitt said, breath steaming. "Ice broke under a sled team. We lost the mule, lost half the sacks." Mara felt the words land like weight on her chest. No mule meant no hauling, even if the road cleared. Half the sacks meant rationing wasn't a plan anymore. It was a countdown. DeWitt's gaze slid into the warm interior. His nostrils flared at the compost smell, but he didn't mock it now. He looked calculating. "How much can you spare?" he asked. "Not can you help. Not will you write. How much?" Mara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the two men behind him, Henry Brooks among them, and saw something new in Henry's eyes. Not laughter. Hunger. Mara stepped aside, letting DeWitt see the beds fully, letting him see the green that shouldn't exist in this season. "Come in," she said, "and mind where you step." DeWitt ducked through the low door, like a man entering a confession booth. The two men followed, awkward in the tight tunnel. Warm air fogged their faces immediately, and for a moment they simply stood, absorbing it the way starving people absorb the smell of bread. Henry Brooks's eyes locked on the lettuce. His mouth opened, then closed again, as if he didn't trust what he was seeing. DeWitt cleared his throat. "This is warmer than my house," he admitted, sounding offended by the fact. "It's supposed to be," Mara said. She kept her voice calm, but her pulse was loud in her ears. The greenhouse had become more than an experiment. It was leverage, whether she wanted it or not. DeWitt walked along the beds without touching, hands clasped behind his back. "If the road's gone," he said, "we need calories." "Greens aren't calories," Mara replied. "They're vitamins. They keep you from getting sick while you stretch calories. If you want calories, you need grain, beans, fat. This buys time." Henry muttered. "Time for what?" "For you to stop pretending the wagon will save you," Mara said, eyes on him. Henry flushed, but he didn't argue. He glanced at DeWitt, seeking permission to be angry. DeWitt didn't give it. The councilman looked at the compost trench. "So that's the stove." "It's a furnace if you treat it right," Mara corrected, "and poison if you treat it wrong." DeWitt's brow furrowed. "Poison." Mara pointed at the ridge flap and the new snorkel pipe. "Compost releases gases, mostly carbon dioxide, some ammonia. You vent it. You control humidity. You don't sleep in here with everything sealed tight." Henry's voice came out rough. Preacher said it's unclean. Mara turned to him. Your preacher can come inspect, she said. He can see the drainage trench so water doesn't stagnate. He can see the beds are raised, not sitting in rot. He can smell the difference between healthy compost and foul sludge. If he still calls it unclean, then he's choosing pride over evidence. DeWitt's gaze sharpened. Evidence is one thing. Feeding the town is another. Mara's hands tightened around the lantern handle. You want greens, she said. Then you help me keep the system stable. DeWitt's jaw worked. What do you want? There it was. Not a question about method, a question about control. Mara did not enjoy the answer she had to give. Materials, she said. Canvas, wire, nails, oilcloth, anything to seal glazing, and 2 able-bodied men to shovel snow off the roof after every storm. Not when it's convenient. Every storm. Henry started to protest, but Mara cut him with a look. Snow load is math, she said. A roof doesn't care about your feelings. DeWitt nodded slowly, as if he'd already calculated the political cost. I can spare men for shoveling. And you can spare nails? Mara asked. DeWitt hesitated. Josiah holds most of them. Mara's eyes narrowed. Then you'll pry them loose. Henry shifted uncomfortably. You can't just... DeWitt snapped. Enough! He turned back to Mara. How much lettuce? Mara exhaled through her nose. She walked to the first bed and pinched a leaf between her fingers, feeling it snap. I can harvest outer leaves from maybe 60 plants today, she said. Not heads. That gives regrowth. If you take everything, you get 1 meal and then bare soil. DeWitt's face tightened at the limitation. 60 plants for 200 people. It's not a feast, Mara said. It's a signal, and it's prevention. Henry's voice dropped. People are talking about taking what they need. Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Then you'd better start talking louder, she said to DeWitt, because if a crowd storms this place, they'll trample the beds, crack the panes, and you'll lose the only living food we have. This isn't like stealing flour. Once it's destroyed, you can't replace it. DeWitt looked around at the low roof, the earthen walls, the careful seals. He saw, maybe for the first time, that the greenhouse wasn't a stash. It was a machine made of fragile parts. I'll post a guard, he said. No, Mara said immediately. A guard makes it look like I'm hoarding. It makes me a target. You post a work detail. Men with shovels and a list. Make it public. Make it town-owned. Henry blinked. Town-owned? Mara nodded. You want people to respect it? Then you make it theirs to protect. But I run it. You don't vote on ventilation. DeWitt's lips pressed thin. Then, grudgingly, he nodded again. Fine. They stepped out together into the entry tunnel. The cold slapped them as the door opened, and the contrast made the warmth inside feel like a miracle, even to Mara. Outside, the sky had that clear, cruel brightness again, the kind that meant another hard night. As the men left, Mara stayed at the threshold, watching their backs. She could already imagine what would happen when word spread. Laughter would turn into questions, questions into demands, demands into hands reaching. She shut the door and leaned her forehead against the wood for one long breath. Then she turned back to the beds. The system was stable, for now, but stability in winter was never a resting place. It was something you rebuilt daily. She began harvesting with a sharp knife, taking only the outer leaves, leaving the hearts intact. Each cut was careful, surgical. Each leaf dropped into her basket like a coin into a jar. Halfway down the row, she heard the first crack, a sharp, brittle snap from above. Mara looked up and saw a window pane spiderwebbing near the ridge, the crack racing outward like lightning. The resin bandage she'd made days ago had been on another pane. This one was new, born of night cold and morning sun. She stared at it, and the open loop tightened again. She could grow food, but could she keep the roof from failing when she no longer controlled the weather or the people? By afternoon, The settlement's hunger had a direction. It followed DeWitt and the work detail up the hill, followed the baskets of lettuce down, followed the rumor that green leaves existed under glass, while the rest of the world froze. People didn't run. Cold kept them dignified, but they gathered in knots near the trading shed, near the meeting house, near any place news might fall like crumbs. Mara delivered the first basket to the communal cook fire behind the meeting house. The pot there was mostly water, with a few beans sinking like stones. When she tipped in the greens, steam rose carrying a scent that made heads turn. It wasn't the smell of fullness, it was the smell of summer memory. A woman began to cry quietly, face hidden in her shawl. A boy reached out to touch a lettuce leaf as if it might vanish. Mara watched, throat tight, and forced herself to stay practical. Emotion could feed morale, but it wouldn't keep the greenhouse alive. She returned to the hill and found Eli waiting by the trench with a bundle under his arm. "Canvas," he said, breathless, "and wire. Took it off my own shed door." Mara accepted it with a nod that meant more than thanks. "You'll want a better latch," she said, "or someone will take your door next." Eli gave a humorless smile. "Let them. I'd rather lose a door than my sister." Mara's grip tightened on the bundle. The town wasn't just hungry. It was beginning to choose sides, between old pride and new methods. Inside, she went straight to the cracked pane near the ridge. The spiderweb had spread, but the glass still sat in its frame. She couldn't replace it, so she turned it into something else, a laminated panel. She laid canvas strips across the inside, saturated them with resin warmed to near liquid, and pressed them into the cracks. Once cooled, the canvas would hold shards in place if the pane failed, like a net. It would also reduce light slightly, but losing a little light was better than losing the whole roof. Then she heard shouting outside. Not distant, close. Mara set down the resin pot and moved to the door. Through the entry tunnel, she could hear multiple voices, overlapping, anger and fear in equal measure. When she opened the door, cold air rushed in along with noise. A cluster of settlers stood in the trench, faces red, eyes hard. Henry Brooks was there, and beside him, Josiah Pike, coat collar turned up like armor. DeWitt stood a step behind them, jaw set, trying to look in control. Josiah pointed past Mara's shoulder. "There it is," he said. "All that warmth, all that growing." A woman with chapped lips stepped forward. "My baby hasn't had milk in 2 days," she said, voice shaking. "Are you going to tell me there's food down there and we're to wait our turn?" Mara's chest tightened. "There isn't enough to give freely," she said. "Not yet. If you strip it, it dies." Henry pushed closer. "You're picking and choosing. Council gets first taste, then the rest of us beg?" Mara's eyes snapped to DeWitt. "That's not what I agreed to," she said. DeWitt's face flickered. Guilt or irritation, she couldn't tell. "It went to the pot," he said. "For everyone." Josiah's smile was thin. "And who decided that? You or her?" He nodded at Mara like she was an odd tool. "A woman with a hole in the hill thinks she can ration green leaves like she's queen." Mara felt heat rise behind her eyes. She forced it down. Rage would make her reckless. Recklessness would break glass. "This isn't a pantry," she said loudly enough for them all. "It's a system. It produces if you don't destroy it." The woman with the baby shook her head. "Systems don't feed babies," she whispered. Mara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Lettuce won't feed your baby," she said, gentler. "But it will keep you from getting sick while we stretch what we have. If you want more, you help me build more." Henry laughed, bitter. "Build? With what? The nails Josiah's sitting on?" All eyes shifted to Josiah. He spread his hands. "I trade," he said. "I don't donate." Eli appeared at the edge of the crowd, eyes wary. Mara saw him tighten his grip on a shovel. Not for work. Mara's mind raced through options. If this turned into a shove, someone would fall into the glazing. One cracked pane would become 10, In this cold, a broken roof meant a dead greenhouse by morning. She chose the only move that could diffuse a crowd: transparency. Mara stepped fully out into the trench so she wasn't guarding the doorway like a hoarder. "Come tomorrow at noon," she said. 10 people, not 50. You'll see how it works. You'll see the compost bed. You'll see the vents. You'll see the record board. And you'll hear the rule: harvest outer leaves only, or you kill it. Henry sneered. "And if we don't like your rule, then you'll like hunger less," Mara said. The crowd murmured, restless. DeWitt stepped forward, seizing the opening. "We'll organize it," he said. "Work detail, building detail. Anyone who wants greens helps shovel snow and haul manure when the thaw comes." Josiah's eyes narrowed. "Manure. Manure," Mara echoed, unflinching. "The thing you all pretend you don't live next to." The woman with the baby looked at Mara, then at the door behind her. Finally she nodded once, small and exhausted. "Tomorrow," she said. The crowd dispersed slowly, like a tide pulling back. But Mara knew tides returned. When the last boots crunched away, DeWitt lingered. He didn't meet her eyes. "The wagon won't come," he said quietly. "Not soon." Mara's stomach sank. "How do you know?" DeWitt swallowed. "A rider made it in from Larch Bend before the storm. He says the pass is blocked, trees down, drifts taller than a man. They turned back. No supplies, no rescue, just winter and whatever they could make." Mara looked up at the hill's white shoulder, at the low roofline that had to hold. She thought of the laminated pane, the dwindling water barrel, the nails that were now political currency. The story had changed. It wasn't about being laughed at anymore. It was about being the only thing between a town and starvation. The next storm arrived like a verdict. It began with a hush, air so still Mara could hear snow crystals ticking against the glazing. Then a low roar rolled over the ridge as wind found the settlement again. By evening, the sky was a lid, and the world below it was a churning white tunnel. DeWitt's work detail never showed. Men were busy saving their own roofs. Mara was alone with the greenhouse. She lit 2 lanterns, one at the entry, one by the beds, because the storm stole what little daylight existed, and plants that lived on thin winter light could not afford darkness on top of cold. Lanterns weren't sun, but they kept her hands steady, and in crisis, steady hands mattered. Snow began to thump the roof in heavy pats, not powder, wet, wind-packed slabs, the kind that stuck. Mara checked the interior air with her skin first, cheeks, knuckles, the tender spot beneath her eyes, warm but climbing. The compost had surged again, likely from the crowd's visit and the door opening yesterday, which had cooled the heap's outer layer and prompted her to add more straw. Now it was eating fast. Too much heat meant too much moisture. Moisture meant condensation on glass. Condensation meant ice if the inner surface cooled even briefly. Ice meant added weight, like gluing snow to the roof from below. She opened the ridge vent wider, then adjusted the lower intake baffle she'd built from scrapboard. The airflow increased. The lantern flames leaned. Humidity began to drop, slowly. A violent gust hit. The roof ribs moaned. Somewhere above, a pane rattled in its frame. Mara climbed onto the service ledge, bracing a shoulder against the earth wall, and pushed a support pole tighter under the central rib. She'd already added 2 posts after the last sag. Now she added a third, wedging it so hard the top bit into wood and the bottom dug into packed dirt. Outside, wind scoured snow across the glazing. It should have slid. It didn't. The wet snow plastered itself on like mortar. Mara's breath shortened. She needed to clear the roof, but going outside in this wind was like stepping into a river. Worse, the door trench was already filling. If she went out and the drift collapsed behind her, she might not get back in. She had seconds to choose wrong. She made her decision like an engineer, not a hero. She tied a rope around her waist and anchored the other end to a roof rib inside, knotting it twice. If she slipped, she wanted the greenhouse to pull her back. Then she shoved the door open and crawled into the storm. Wind slammed her sideways immediately. Snow filled her ears and mouth. She could barely see her own hands. The rope snapped taut as she crawled up onto the low roof, staying low to keep from being lifted. She found the first reflector board by touch and used it like a sled runner, scraping snow downslope. Wet slabs slid reluctantly, then broke free and thudded off the edge. She worked in short bursts, scrape, shove, breathe, because breathing hurt and she couldn't waste air. A crack sounded under her palm. For a heartbeat, she thought it was glass breaking, but it was ice, inner condensation freezing to the pane and popping loose as the outer snow cooled it. The roof was being attacked from both sides. Mara scraped faster, arms burning. She cleared a strip near the ridge so the vent outlet wouldn't seal. If the vent sealed, the compost would choke and heat would fall. If heat fell, inner condensation would freeze solid. If it froze solid, weight would rise. If weight rose, the roof would fail. Cause and effect, like dominoes. The wind changed direction and tore at her scarf. She lost her grip. Her body slid a foot, then two. The rope jerked her hard at the waist, knocking air from her lungs. Pain flared, but she clung, fingers clawing at a roof rib. She lay there, pressed to glass, and realized she was too cold to be brave. She had maybe 5 minutes before her hands stopped obeying. She crawled back down, dragging the scraper, fighting the wind. At the door, she kicked snow away blindly until wood appeared, then shoved herself into the entry tunnel, rope following like a lifeline. Inside, warmth hit her so suddenly she almost sobbed. She slammed the door and leaned against it, chest heaving, listening to her own ragged breath. The greenhouse was still standing, but the roof above continued to thump under accumulating snow, and the compost heat was now dropping. She could feel it. Opening the door had flushed warm air out. Her outside scrape had helped, but the storm wasn't done. Mara stumbled to the beds and grabbed the harvest basket. If the worst happened, if the roof failed, she needed to get food out before it died under glass and snow. She began cutting outer leaves at speed, hands shaking. Lettuce fell into the basket in a rush of green. She added hardy herbs, anything with leaf and life. A pounding came at the door. "Mara!" Eli's voice strained. "Open up, please." Mara froze. If she opened the door again, she'd bleed heat. But if she didn't, Eli might die in the drift. She ran to the latch and pulled. Eli fell into the entry tunnel, half crawling, face raw. Behind him, 2 figures huddled. Children, bundled, shivering. "The cook fire's out," Eli gasped. "People are fighting over the last meal. DeWitt sent me. He says bring what you can." Mara looked at the children's blue lips, at their wide eyes. The greenhouse's open loop snapped into its payoff. Outside was hunger and chaos. Inside was fragile warmth and food that existed only if she kept this machine alive. She shoved the basket into Eli's arms. "Take this to the meeting house," she said. "Give leaves to the children first. No arguments." Eli swallowed. "And you?" Mara turned back toward the roof supports, hearing the ribs creak under another wet slap. "I keep it standing," she said. As Eli crawled back into the storm, Mara wedged another post under the sagging rib, feeling wood strain, feeling the thin margin between proof and ruin. Above her, winter hammered. Below her hands, the hill held steady. Now she had to hold steady too. The storm broke sometime before dawn, not with sunlight, but with silence. The wind simply stopped, as if exhausted, and the settlement woke to a world that looked newly made. Smooth drifts, buried fences, chimneys poking up like dark fingers. Mara hadn't slept. She'd spent the night pacing the narrow aisle, checking posts, scraping inner ice off panes with a wooden spatula, opening and closing vents in careful increments the way you nurse a fever. She'd learned to read the greenhouse by sound. The gentle drip meant safe. The sharp tick meant ice. The low groan meant a rib asking for mercy. When daylight seeped through the snow-thinned sky, she finally dared to open the door. The trench was nearly filled. She dug with frantic efficiency, tossing snow behind her, clearing a path wide enough to crawl out. Her hands felt like wood. Her waist still ached where the rope had yanked her. At the edge of the hill she stopped and looked back at the roof. It had bowed, yes, subtly, like a man bending under a heavy pack, but it hadn't broken. The laminated pane near the ridge held its spiderweb, canvas and resin gripping the shards like tendons. Snow clung in patches, but the strip she'd cleared near the vent had kept the greenhouse breathing. She walked down into town. The meeting house door stood open. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and something startling. Green. A pot simmered again, thin soup made richer by leaf and herb. Children sat on the floor with bowls, their faces less hollow than yesterday. Eli stood near the stove with his arm bandaged, a bruise dark on his cheek. DeWitt was there too, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. He watched Mara enter like a man watching a tool he'd once mocked save his own life. The room fell quiet. Henry Brooks stood by the wall, shoulders hunched, not meeting anyone's gaze. Josiah Pike sat on a bench with his hands clasped tight, as if the warmth made him uncomfortable. Mara didn't wait to be invited. She set her shovel against the wall and spoke to the whole room. "The greenhouse held," she said. Her voice came out hoarse, but it carried. It held because it was built to share the hill's steadiness, and because I braced it before the storm decided. It will not hold if it becomes a battlefield. A woman, the same one with the baby, stood slowly. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but her chin lifted. "My boy ate," she said quietly. "He didn't cry all night." Mara nodded once. That was the closest thing to victory she'd allow herself. DeWitt stepped forward. He looked like he was swallowing nails. "Mara Kessler," he said, and the formality sounded strange on his tongue. "I owe you an apology. The council owes you one." A murmur ran through the room. Agreement, discomfort, relief. Mara met his eyes. "Apologies don't seal glass," she said. "I need materials, and I need labor, not later, today." DeWitt nodded quickly, grateful to be given a task instead of shame. "We'll make a list," he said. "We'll requisition what's needed." Josiah flinched at the word requisition. Mara's gaze slid to him. "You'll sell at fair trade," she said, "or you'll donate. Your choice." Josiah's throat bobbed. For a moment he looked ready to argue, but then he glanced at the children with bowls and seemed to shrink. "Fair trade," he muttered. Henry cleared his throat. He didn't look at Mara until the last second, and when he did, his eyes were raw. "I called it wrong," he said. "I said things I shouldn't. If you're teaching, I want to learn." Mara felt something loosen in her chest, tension unspooling after weeks of bracing. She didn't smile, not yet, but she nodded. "Bring a shovel," she said, "and bring manure when the thaw softens the piles." A few people laughed, not mocking this time, just the nervous laughter of folks accepting a new kind of work. Even the preacher's wife, standing near the back, gave a thin smile and said, "Maybe God's season includes ingenuity." Over the next hours, the settlement moved with purpose instead of panic. Men went to the hill with shovels to clear snow from the glazing. Women brought sacks of straw saved from bedding. Eli organized a roster, not as a guard detail, but as a maintenance crew. 2 people each morning to check vents, 1 to inspect roof posts, 1 to record observations on Mara's chalkboard so the knowledge didn't die with her. Mara stood inside her greenhouse later, watching the first volunteer, Henry, awkwardly open the ridge flap, the exact width she'd marked with a notch. His hands were clumsy, but careful. The compost breathed. The air warmed. Lettuce leaves lifted toward the pale light, as if they understood they were no longer a secret. By week's end, a second pit was being dug on another south-facing slope, and a third beside the schoolhouse. The idea spread not as a rumor now, but as a method with rules: depth, drainage, venting, reflectors, compost ratios. Children learned to pack straw bales tight against frames the way they learned sums. In spring, when the pass finally opened and a wagon limped in with flour and news, the driver stared at the hill and asked why green patches clung to it like stubborn moss. DeWitt, standing beside Mara, answered before she could. "Because she built for winter," he said, and we finally learned. A year later, someone nailed a simple board above the first low door, letters burned into it with a poker. Hill House Garden, built in the hard winter. No mention of madness, no mention of laughter, just a record that in the season when the world narrowed to survival, one woman had widened it again with dirt, light, and stubborn heat.